When my husband passed away, the silence of our home became unbearable. The walls that once echoed with his laughter now seemed to trap me in a quiet that was far too heavy. Every photograph on the wall felt like a memory pressing down on my chest, reminding me of what I had lost. My son Ethan was only 13 at the time, old enough to understand but too young to process it fully. At first, he withdrew into himself, becoming quieter than I had ever known him to be. He would sit in his room for hours, staring at the window as though waiting for something or someone. I thought it was grief, just like mine, but as weeks turned into months, I began noticing small changes in him that I couldn't explain. He started writing in a notebook every night, long after I thought he was asleep. Sometimes I would find him awake at dawn, his lamp still burning, his eyes red from tears he refused to shed in front of me. He avoided my gaze whenever I asked him about it. There were moments when I heard him whispering, as though talking to someone who wasn't there. I told myself it was his way of holding on to his father, perhaps speaking to him in the only way he knew how. But there was something about the way his voice trembled in those whispers that unsettled me. My own grief was complicated. Losing my husband meant losing not just the man I loved, but the partner who had shared every responsibility, every laugh, and every small joy of life with me. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed and reach across the sheets, only to touch emptiness. I told myself I had to stay strong for Ethan, but there were countless nights when I broke down quietly, covering my mouth with the pillow so he wouldn't hear. Then one morning, as I was making breakfast, Ethan came downstairs, holding the notebook close to his chest. He sat down, stared at me for a long moment, and finally said, "Dad told me something last night." My heart froze. I tried to steady my voice and asked him gently what he meant. He looked down, fidgeting with the edges of the notebook, and whispered, "He said I have to take care of you now." Tears pricked my eyes, and I had to turn away so he wouldn't see me break. I didn't know if this was his imagination, his grief, or something else I couldn't begin to understand. But it was the first time in weeks he had spoken openly about his feelings, so I didn't correct him or tell him it wasn't real. Instead, I nodded and told him his father would be proud of him. Around that time, an old friend of ours began visiting again. Michael had been my husband's closest companion since college. He was there for me during the funeral, offering quiet support, and afterward, he would check in every few weeks. At first, I resisted his presence. I didn't want anyone to see me so fragile, so broken. But one evening, when I found myself unable to fix the leaking faucet, Michael showed up after Ethan had called him without telling me. He repaired it without a word, but when I thanked him, he looked at me with such softness in his eyes that I almost broke all over again. From then on, his visits became more frequent. He would bring groceries when he noticed I was struggling, or help Ethan with his school projects. Slowly, our house began to feel less empty when he was around. There was a gentleness about him, a patience that reminded me that not all love stories end with death. At first, I felt guilty for noticing. My heart belonged to my husband, and yet here was this man quietly mending not just my broken sink, but small pieces of my broken spirit too. Ethan, strangely, seemed to accept Michael's presence even more easily than I did. One night, after Michael had left, Ethan said to me, "Dad told me it's okay for you to smile again." I was stunned, tears rolling down my cheeks before I could stop them. I asked Ethan what he meant, and he simply shrugged, saying he had written it down in his notebook because he didn't want to forget. That notebook became a mystery to me, a place where he poured conversations I wasn't part of. Yet I couldn't bring myself to read it without his permission. Months passed, and I found myself laughing again, sometimes at Michael's stories, sometimes at Ethan's growing sense of humor. Life was still full of grief, but it wasn't just grief anymore. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Michael stayed a little longer than usual. We sat in the living room after Ethan had gone to bed, listening to the rain. I remember telling him how afraid I was of forgetting my husband, of moving forward in any way that might dishonor his memory. Michael reached for my hand but stopped just short, as though asking permission without words. I didn't move away. His touch was steady, not demanding, just there, a quiet anchor in a storm I had been lost in for far too long. Ethan noticed, of course. Children see more than we think. One afternoon, He handed me his notebook, something he had never done before. "I think you should read this," he said. I hesitated, but he insisted. Inside, I found pages filled with conversations he believed he had with his father. The handwriting was shaky in places, smudged by tears. The words broke me and healed me all at once. "Take care of Mom," one page read. "Tell her she deserves happiness." Another said, "Don't be afraid to let her laugh again." I closed the notebook with trembling hands, pulling Ethan into my arms. "Do you really believe Dad said these things to you?" I asked softly. Ethan nodded, eyes filled with a quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. "I hear him when I'm sad. He doesn't want us to stay broken." That night, as I lay awake, I thought about everything. My love for my husband, my grief, Ethan's strange but comforting belief, and the quiet way Michael had become a part of our lives. Love doesn't replace what was lost, I realized. It doesn't erase it. It grows in the cracks left behind, stitching together a new kind of strength. Eventually, I allowed myself to accept that love again. Slowly, carefully, without rushing, Michael and I built something gentle. He never tried to replace my husband, never stepped into his shadow. Instead, he stood beside it, offering light where the darkness had been too thick. Ethan, far from resisting, seemed to thrive under the new warmth in our home. His laughter returned, brighter than before, and though I knew he still missed his father, he carried him in ways I would never fully understand. One evening, as we all sat together watching the fire crackle in the fireplace, Ethan looked at me and said, "Dad's happy now. He knows we're okay." His voice was calm, sure, and for the first time since my husband had passed, I felt peace settle over me like a soft blanket. The journey wasn't easy. Grief still visited, sometimes suddenly, sometimes quietly, like an old companion who refused to leave completely. But now alongside grief, there was love, laughter, and hope. I learned that moving forward didn't mean letting go. It meant carrying the past with tenderness while still making space for the future. And so when my husband passed, my son did change in ways I couldn't understand at first. His whispered conversations and mysterious notebook felt like puzzles I couldn't solve. But in truth, he became the bridge between my grief and my healing, reminding me that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms, it lingers, and if we're brave enough, it blooms again.